It's a co-edited volume with some 30 speakers, so actually I'll probably get a few pens only, which is just like the state school my children go to. Okay, good news and bad news. The good news, the bad news is for those of you who try to arrive late just for the plenary, sorry, we're running late, you're still going to have to hear my paper. And the good news is we are running late. The discussion is something that is very important, and I'll try and do two things. One, to actually dovetail what I have to say directly towards discussion, and two, to keep it brief. Now, in part, what I was proposing to raise as my topic for discussion is really a sort of a cheating process, which is it's to ask the kinds of questions that we need to ask. Okay? And in part it comes, and it was exemplified by the discussion we just had a moment ago. So there were two things that became problematic about the discussion we had a moment ago. One was that when we were talking about the question of hood and whether it is gendered or not, we cannot answer this question by talking about whether in Islam women have participated in the process of scholarship or not, or whether in Iqbal's time there was a particular structure of relations and so on. The question that we were asking very specifically was this: in as much as Iqbal is talking about the process of ego and selfhood, and that process of selfhood has a philosophical exposition to it, which is ungendered and in the abstract form, which takes analogies and metaphors and so on, similes from the figures of the dew, the drop, the ocean, the eaglet, the animal, and so on. What about when it becomes concrete? What about when it becomes established in the forms in which socially, in society, in community, that process of sharpening the selfhood against, because it's a selfhood that is established in terms of struggle, in terms of continuous movement, that the language in which that struggle and that movement is described is gendered, I would argue. And I would argue that more than that, there is a process in which, for all the discounting that we may want to do in terms of the historical conditions, Iqbal's own response to the so-called New Woman movement, etc., there is a specificity to the way in which Iqbal envisages the role of men and women, which is not simply one of complementarity and separate roles. It is actually one which I would argue is hierarchical and subordinate. But that is part of the issues that we'll put for discussion. Obviously, it's contentious and it raises a lot of obvious passionate responses. The second one would be in relation to the question that was being discussed about whether hoodie itself, as a term and as a concept and as a way of thinking that Iqbal develops, is or is not against the tradition of his time. Now, Javed has a very good discussion of this in his book, but the question isn't settled that way, because in part it has to do with what is it we want from it, from our reading of it. If we're saying, we pick up this text and we're saying, what does it say to me? Okay? What does this philosophy of egohood and of selfhood and so on enable me to do with it? That's a separate question. It has to do with what is today, in specific contexts, the way of thinking about affirmation of selfhood or annihilation in the context that we are specifically entangled with. A different question is to say, what did it mean for Iqbal's intervention in his time? Okay? These are entirely separate questions, and it depends what it is that you want to do with your approach to the text. So basically, these are the questions that I was trying to raise. I was wanting to speak about reading Iqbal, and the choice of Culture and Imperialism for my title was supposed to signal two things. Firstly, that questions of culture, the cultural, the condition of imperialism in his time, including what we would call today cultural imperialism and cultural resistance to imperialism, were central concerns to Iqbal. Related to this, as a second layer, I would say that culture and imperialism, as discussed by Iqbal, as enacted in Iqbal's responses, is one of the strands that reverberates with us and which has a particular form of syntony with the way that we read Iqbal in our present context. for reasons which are perhaps too obvious to have to name, but which we can go back to. And a third layer, perhaps more arguable, is that culture and imperialism are frames which at present speak to how we read Iqbal. They, let's say, bear down upon certain attempts to frame the reading of Iqbal, to contain it, to de-radicalize it, to domesticate it, to police it, to foreclose it. So what are the particular bits of Iqbal that get read? I mean, without meaning any particular disrespect, there was a recent event here by the Radical Middle Way, which focused on Iqbal's Shikwa and Jawabi Shikwa. Now, the reading of that particular text took a particular form, which is constituted by the approach that the Radical Middle Way takes in its mission towards Muslims at present. So we have to be attentive to the forms in which Iqbal is read, the reasons he's read, the contexts in which he's read and approached. The second thing that I wanted to do with naming the paper Culture and Imperialism was really to evoke Edward Said, whose famous book of 1993 bore that title, and evoke in the broader sense, not because I want to call upon that text specifically, but I want to call upon a series of moves that are encoded in the name Edward Said. And basically, if the title that I had originally thought for this paper, which was Reading Iqbal, Worlding Iqbal, is a way of, in shorthand, saying the kinds of moves that I would like to bring to your attention, which have essentially to do with citing, that is, putting, situating, contextualizing both the texts and their readings in terms of our relation with Iqbal. Now, a paper that I would have liked to have heard, that I would even like to read, is a paper on the afterlives of Iqbal, the global travels of his name and of his texts. To pick up on what Javed Majid was saying earlier about the question of travel, there is an additional dimension to travel, which is the way that his texts travel. And I'll be coming back to that again in relation to Edward Said with the notion of traveling theory. But it basically has to do with the way that his name and his text, and I say name and text specifically because often the name travels detached from the text, with no particular relation to the text, a sort of monumentalized name, a name which is a sort of Midas touch, a name that you evoke as for licensing, for appealing, for legitimation of particular projects that reclaim and essentially are contestation for the name of Iqbal at the service of different projects. So it's everyone wants a piece of him, is one way of putting it, and everyone has their designs on him. Such a paper, which we could call something like The Many Posthumous Iqbals, is of course entirely beyond my own linguistic capacity, let alone the scholarly one. And in fact, I would even suggest, would almost double into a meta-history of 20th century Islamic thought. Because to write about the way that Iqbal has been read is essentially to rethread the dialogue which makes up the tradition of 20th century Muslim responses to the question of the modernity and modernism. Now, still, without providing such a paper, thinking or imagining or even conceiving such a paper already suggests some of the questions that evoking Edward Said helps us to raise. So I said that some of you saw the abstract that circulated. I said that I was interested in the question of how Iqbal speaks to us. Well, it's just as well to make a couple of preliminary qualifications first.